Okay, welcome to this slideshow entitled Improving Learning by Improving Student CAS State Scores. This is part of a series of slideshows on Cognitive Affective Social State, or CAS state, and we're going to be looking at the impact that your school has on the mental states of your students. Now, a good school could be said to have a positive ecological impact on the mental states of its students. Now, what I mean by that is that one would expect that in a good school, the mental states of the students when they're on campus are improved from their normal mental states that they inhabit. And we've been studying the impacts that schools have on the mental states of students who are participating in their lessons and trying to improve them. So how can you measure the mental states of students in a school? Well, we've developed a measure of Cognitive Affective Social State called CAS for short, CAS state, and this is based on Walker's 7-factor CAS model, which he has written about and published in a series of papers in 2014. And as the name implies, it covers the state of a student's cognition, their affective state, which is their feelings, and their social state, which is the way they're interacting with other students. So it's a broad measure based around 7 factors which are listed at the bottom here of this little chart. So if we look down here, we can see the 7 factors are disclosure, embracing change, trust of self, trust of others, perspective, processing, and then finally planning. And these 7 factors are measured and standardized against a 0 to 15 scale, so a graph can be produced. And this provides us with a measure of a student's cognitive, affective, social state. Now, we first measure the instinctive CAS state of individual students to get a baseline reading. So we're interested in what's the state a student is in mentally when they are not participating in any school, outside the school grounds, if you like, not engaged in the learning process. And secondly, we want to measure the impact the school is having on that cognitive affective social state, so we then measure the ecological CAS state, to use that word, of individual students when they are engaging in different lessons. So we're interested in how that mental state, cognitive affective social state, changes when the student is engaged in the learning process. And we can be very specific about this. We can assess not just the learning process in general, but the specific learning of a student when they're engaged, for example, in single lesson, in their maths lesson, or in a different curriculum lesson, a science lesson, or an English lesson. In fact, what we tend to do is to measure, first of all, the instinctive CAS state of each student, and then we measure their CAS states when they're engaged in those 3 primary subjects, which gives us a comparison of 4 individual CAS state sets of data for each particular student. Now, this allows us to form a mean model of the school, of the whole school population's instinctive CAS state. So we can take your school population and we can look at their instinctive CAS state. So your children from your school, what is their CAS state on an average when they're not engaged in their lessons, in their learning? Now, one of the interesting things is that when you look at a particular age group, let's say year 10 students, and you look at year 10 populations of students from schools around the country in different areas, when they're outside the learning context, when they're not engaged in lessons, the CAS state score is remarkably similar. So here we've got a chart in which we've got 4 different school populations of year 10 students, school B, M, E and H, 4 different schools, 4 different parts of the country, 4 different school sectors in fact. So it's 4 totally independent sets of students, and yet instinctive CAS state score is remarkably similar. Look at how these patterns of these 4 sets of data are so similar across the 7 factors. Now, this is the CAS state score for the instinctive state of year 10 students, and it provides a baseline to then understand whether that CAS state score shifts when this population of students, when your students come on campus and are engaged in lessons in your school. So what I'm going to do is to overlay now for these 4 particular schools the measures that were taken of their ecological year 10 CAS state scores, and we'll see as I do that you will have noticed that those graphs, those charts, those kind of contour landscapes have shifted. In other words, what we found and what we have found is that schools have an impact on the cognitive affective social state of their students. The population shifts when they're on campus engaged in lessons. Let's have a little bit of a closer look at some of those impacts that we can observe. So here's a particular school just to illustrate, and in the blue at the back there we've got the measure of those Year 10 students and their instinctive CAS state score. And as you can see, there's this familiar pattern: lowish disclosure, high embracing change, high trust of self, low trust of others, high relatively medial actually perspective, relatively medial processing, and then a high focus on outcome when it comes to planning. And you'll see that almost all of these factors alter a bit when those students, as a mean population, are engaged in their lessons, taken as a mean across 3 lessons, core subjects, English, Maths and Science. And in particular we notice this quite dramatic ecological shift, that trust of self drops and trust of others rises. And I'm going to be coming onto that and the significance of that in a moment, which is actually slightly counterintuitive. So another way just to look at that same data, provide that chart in a non-three-dimensional way, is to look at it in this chart. We've just got the 2 profiles, and you can see the difference between the dark of the instinctive and the light of the in situ ecological in school overlaid. And this provides us with the measure of the ecological impact of the school, or perhaps we could put it, the ecological dividend of the school. What positive or negative impact is the school having on the mental states of its students? And we're now able to measure this and quantify it, so it's not just an instinct or putting our finger in the air and feeling the state of the wind. Now we find that different schools impose a different ecological state upon their students. So here's a second school. Again, we've got in the dark green here the background familiar pattern that we saw in that first chart of Year 10 students, and then overlaid we can see this very even ecological CAS state when those students are engaged in their lessons. Here we are, same data here represented in a 3-dimensional chart. You can see how those peaks and how those troughs flatten out into this very flat structure. So this is a school that imposes a very consistent collective state across these 5 factors across all students. Contrast that data with this here, where again what we see is the instinctive pattern, and we see the ecological school pattern as almost exactly the same. It's following it almost exactly, remarkably precisely. And again, the 3-dimensional chart represents that. It's much less in this school that the school is imposing a CAS state upon its students. It's a little bit more as if the students are imposing their CAS state on the school. So having looked at whether schools impose a CAS state on their students and whether that is a beneficial thing, what impact that is having upon their learning, and having established that schools do that and they do affect the mental state of students whether they like it or not, we then went on to look at whether CAS state varied across ability sets. So we're drilling down now into the data, and we're looking now at Year 10 data, and we're looking at different academic sets in Year 10 and seeing whether there are any similar patterns. And we've done this study across these 4 schools, and we've seen very similar patterns emerging. So here's a set 7 maths set 7, but this is looking across all their subjects, and you can see we've got the instinctive CAS scores for maths set 7 students at the back here in grey, and then the English scores, so when they're engaged in English and then when they're engaged in maths, in front here. First thing you notice is perhaps how remarkably similar those graphs are. This population of set 7 students really don't shift their mean CAS state as they move from lesson to lesson at all. And we also notice that trust of self and trust of others is quite high, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So this is the pattern that we've seen in set 7s. It's quite consistent, across different schools, little change across from subject lesson to subject lesson. Have a look at set 5 now, and we see again a fairly similar pattern. We've got one more subject in here now. We've got science in green, but we see this consistency across from the instinctive to English, science and maths, with one notable difference. We suddenly got a little peak here, and the peak is around this factor of trust of others. So trust of others in set 5 has just peaked a bit. It's higher than it was in set 7. Go on to set 2 now, and we see, interesting, that pattern has continued. In fact, it's got amplified. Trust of others remains as a high peak there, but trust of self, this is in maths, has dropped. And so we see this pattern of low trust of self but high trust of others in our set 2 students. We also notice that the instinctive trust of self of maths of set 2 students is that bit higher. Roll on to set 1, and we find that this pattern is reinforced, and it seems to be becoming more consistent as we've gone up the sets. And it's a pattern where we find this high trust of others and low trust of self. Now we find it across all 3 subject lessons, in contrast to the instinctive state of high trust of self, low trust of others. Let's look at that data in another way. It's the same chart we were just looking at, but let's turn it round 180 degrees. We're looking at it from the back now, and we're seeing the grey instinctive state, and you can see how the instinctive state of set 1 students here, so we're looking at set 1 data, is this high peak of high trust of self and low trust of others. That's their instinctive CAS state. And then this consistent shift as they move into their lessons, where there is a shift to becoming highly trusting of others and much lower trusting of themselves. Very counterintuitive, because we all assume that a high sense of self-trust is a position that will be associated with good learning, confidence. Perhaps we'd think that would give students. But in fact, we find that the willingness to engage with others, to question oneself and to be open to other people's ideas is a very, very shared factor borne out by statistical analysis across high-performing students. We've seen this pattern here that we've just been looking at, and we've seen this pattern here across low-performing students, very consistently across our populations of set 1, set 7 students in year 10 across the country. Now you might then think to yourself, well, a CAS state and the ability to shift CAS state to a more optimal position is just related to the intrinsic ability of students, and some high-performing students have it and others don't. And to some extent that appears to be the case. We'll come on to the evidence for that. But it's not simply the case. There's clear evidence that the environment has an impact upon high and low set students, and in particular the expectations that a school has and the perceptions that that students have seem to have an ability to either activate or deactivate student CAS state. Let's look at this chart here, which is a really fascinating chart. Let me explain it. We've got 4 of our 7 CAS factors along here: disclosure, embracing change, trust of self, trust of others. And we've got, these are grade predictions. So we've got a band of students who predicted grade A, grade B, C, D, and then a band of E, F, G predicted students here. Now we see this familiar pattern in grade A predicted students, low trust of self, high trust of others. And we see the contrast with our E, F, G students back here, where they show high trust of self and high trust of others, which is a posture we observe and is predicted to show complacency and really a kind of lack of conscientiousness, lack of concern about taking responsibility for one's learning. So we see these familiar patterns at either end, and you would expect some kind of trend from A to E, F, G as we go through B, C and D. And we see that to some extent with B, so it's quite like A. But then we suddenly find that C grade students remarkably similar to E, F, G students, and we think, oh, okay, so C grade students are showing the same kind of complacency, lack of responsibility for their learning as E, F, G grade students. We're obviously going to find that in D grade as well. hang on, that's very bizarre. D grade students are doing something entirely different. And again, statistical analysis bears this out, that there is a clear, recognized significant difference between D grade students and C and E, F, G grade students. The D grade students are adopting a CAS state that is almost identical and only seen in the A grade predicted students. Now, what's going on there? Well, clearly C grade is a borderline, it's a threshold, and schools put an enormous amount of focus and effort and attention into enabling D grade predicted students to shift up to C grade. So there's enormous school expectation upon this cohort. But there's also probably a perception from these students of both wanting to try hard to get that C grade and also believing that they can do it. So it's an attainable target. In contrast, your EFG grade students probably feel that target is too far away, they can't attain it, so they've given up and they've become indifferent to it there. And sadly, tragically, we're seeing that same pattern with those who cross the threshold. Having crossed the threshold, C grade students are also showing and manifesting that pattern of indifference and lack of responsibility. So there's some really big implications here for summative assessment and grade predictions and the way that we set student expectations in terms of the school having an activating or deactivating effect on student CAS state. And as I say, this isn't anything to do with the intrinsic ability of students. It's to do with the state that students are enabled to be in when they are engaged in their lessons. Now, having said all that, we were also interested to see whether there was any difference between high attaining students and their CAS scores as they move from lesson to lesson, and low attaining students. And we have found some statistically significant differences between high and low performing students. So here's a high performing student in school H, predicted to get 3 A's, high CAT score. And you can see a modulation across the 3 lessons, maths, English, science here, maths, English, science, of their 7 factors. They're modulating those 7 factors, and they're modulating it to some extent as well from their instinctive score. So there's a self-regulation going on here. Contrast that with this DCD predicted grade student, low CAS score, and there's far less modulation. There's both a similarity across the 7 factors from lesson to lesson, and we see here in English a very similar pattern to self. And this again is fairly consistent. This quite illustrates that low performing students are either very consistent in adopting the same pattern, which again has this feature of high trust of self and others, and this complacency and indifference, or sometimes a defiance, but also sometimes an erratic change that doesn't optimize their learning state, which I'll come on to. So if we look at high performing and then low performing students together, you can see a clear contrast, and this is a pattern that's emerged over and over and over again. In fact, it's enabled us, as we've looked at a couple of hundred students, of both GCSE students and A-level students, to start to model an optimal CAS state. And what we find is that no single CAS state is optimal for a single subject, for different subjects. Different subjects require a different optimal CAS state. Maths requires a different optimal CAS state to science, which requires a different optimal CAS state to English. And I want to look at these in turn. So instinctive CAS state that we could call optimal. Well, there isn't an optimal instinctive CAS state. Okay, we're not interested in how students are made genetically, how they come to school. We're interested in what the school does to the student. And a school and the student have the potential to adopt an optimal CAS state regardless of their starting instinctive CAS state. And what we've identified is the optimal CAS state for maths has this kind of pattern here, and I'll just point out a couple of features. The first is this low trust of self and high trust of others. The second is a perspective that is focused on detached evaluative data rather than personal data, and a focus on learning outcomes and being ordered in their processing. When we look at science, we find a very similar pattern, but a difference in processing and planning. Planning in science needs to be, it's this lower chart here, needs to be more process orientated, more emergent, less focused on the learning outcome, and a bit more connective as well. Contrast the optimal state that we find with high performing students in English. So high performing students in English do something very different. They have a high trust of themselves and a low trust of others. So a high performing student across the curriculum would, when they're engaged in maths, would adopt that low trust of themselves and the high trust of others, that pattern there in maths and science. But when they move into their English lesson, they adopt a high trust of self and a low trust of others. So students are shifting as they move from lesson to lesson across the curriculum during the school day. Students are modulating their CAS state into a state that is optimal. At least that is what high performing students are managing to do. And of course they're doing this entirely instinctively. They're not doing it because teachers are telling them to do it. They're doing it because something within them has learned that this is what they ought to do, and they've developed the ability to self-regulate. They have that metacognitive self-regulation. We find this significant shift in perspective as well, and in processing and planning. And we've identified these patterns really comprehensively and identified that they correlate statistically with CAS scores. And if you're interested in understanding and knowing more about the actual research that's been done behind this and the analysis, then you can read the papers on this website that look and explain the way the research was done and the statistical analysis of CAS and its relationship to cognitive ability testing and student attainment. Now, perhaps this is helping us to understand why the Education Endowment Foundation found overwhelmingly in their recent research that metacognition and ability to self-regulate have the highest impact on student learning progress. Because we're finding now, we're gathering evidence to actually show what students, high-performing students and low-performing students, are actually doing in terms of their modulation of their thinking. So here's just a headline of our evidence. A student's CAS score explains 10 to 15% of academic outcome that is not explained by their CAS score. So CAS score can explain a significant proportion of academic outcome, but 10 to 15% of academic outcome is not explained, which is not explained by CAS score, is explained by CAS score, i.e. the ability of students to adopt the optimal state when they are in lesson to lesson and to modulate that state to the optimal state. We've also developed a really exciting intervention to improve and optimize CAS state through coaching and feedback. And I'm going to be doing a second slideshow on this. So do look at that, CAS state, and improving it through coaching and metacognitive thinking signposts. But here's just a graph just to whet your appetites that shows in green the pre-coaching CAS states adopted by this student here. So we've got the green pre-coaching, and then this is post-coaching. And these were just very short 10-minute coaching sessions once a week for 10 weeks, and at the end of the 10 weeks remeasured CAS state, and you can see significant differences between the pre and the post. That issues to do with, for example, planning here, very low planning and very high disclosure, have been adjusted through the coaching process. They're not ideal. Clearly this student is learning slowly how to be more metacognitive, a little bit like wobbling on a bicycle, but they are taking ownership and responsibility for regulating their thinking strategies, their CAS state, their mental states as they move from lesson to lesson, because they're starting to understand what optimal thinking is. And one of the ways that we improve the quality of CAS state in specific lessons is to give teachers a set of thinking signpost posters, which for each of the 7 factors the teacher can use to enable students to be conscious and clear and explicit about which particular pole of the thinking factor they need to be working on for this learning activity. And it makes that journey, that learning journey, explicit, so that students can make explicit conscious choices together in their lessons to think in the optimal way, rather than this just being guesswork or something which good students do and less strong students just don't do. So we're making, in John Hattie's term, learning visible, making metacognition visible, and we're making it a shared dialogue between the teacher and the students, so that across learning activities whether they are open-ended or peer group or discussive or plenary or independent. Students they're not just learning how to do their subject, they're learning how to learn, they're learning how to think, they are developing a conscious, explicit, metacognitive self-regulation guided by the thinking signposts on the basis of some rigorous research into what is effective and what isn't effective in different lessons. So we are interested in enabling students to move to the optimal CAS state as they engage in different activities. So here's a summary slide for us of this slideshow, which I'll just run through. First of all, we've looked at how schools have an impact on the mental states of students. So regardless of whether you know it or not, your school does have an impact on the mental states of your students when they arrive at 8:30 in the morning. The question is, what impact is it? Secondly, we've looked at the clear differences in CAS state between high and low performing students across their curriculum, but we've also looked at the fact that these are not set in stone, that these can be coached, and that one of the ways that we can coach them collectively is through classroom thinking signposts, which can improve the metacognition of all students, improving student CAS state and raising learning by enabling students to adopt the optimal CAS state for the particular learning activity that they're engaged in at the time. Thank you very much indeed. Do look at the other CAS slideshows and download the papers which explain all the evidence and the research that's gone into this, which has been done by Human Ecology Education through our Footprints program for schools.